Okay, hi. So this is the pre-recorded lecture for week 2 of Biology 3804. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the fitness benefits and fitness costs of living in groups. And I'm also going to include a section at the end about social immunity, which is a topic that we normally cover much later in the course, but it's so relevant today, I thought we should put it up ahead. In the picture here, you can see a group of ants working together to perform this remarkable feat of carrying this glove that's many orders of magnitude more heavier than any one of these ants, carrying it up to their colony somewhere in a tree. And the reason exactly why, who knows, but it's probably because there's some kind of like sweet, sugary substance on this glove. Okay, so before I get into the benefits and costs of social living, I just want to highlight how important social partnerships can be to health. And that's true both in non-human animals and in humans. So this is some data from a study that was done a few years ago on carpenter ants in the lab, and the researchers manipulated the social environment of these ants. They either provided or didn't provide food, and they either had the ants in social groupings or in dyads or alone or alone with young. And what I want you to take home from these graphs, from the one on the left, what I want you to see is that the survival curve, so on the x-axis we've got age or time that an ant would be living, and on the y-axis we've got the proportion of ants in the study that were still alive. So it's good to have that curve be high, right? So the best survival scenario was for the ants that were in social groups, whereas the ants that were housed singly or even in pairs were likely to die much sooner. And in the graph on the right of the slide, what you're seeing is that was true in addition to the effects of food supplementation. So having more food helps ants survive, but just the social cost, the cost of being alone for your health is high for an ant. Ants on their own die much younger. And that's because they've had this long history of evolving to living socially. And so we see similar things in humans. So this is data from a study a few years ago of people's subjective ratings of their own health and happiness. And we're looking at health and happiness against age in year. And so the white triangles are representing people who also rated friendships as being important to them, whereas the black triangles are people who rated friendships as not really mattering so much to them. And so what you see is that the people who rate social bonds as more important are maintaining higher levels of happiness as they age and higher levels of subjective health. Okay, so why have humans and ants evolved to be social? What are the reasons that have led to this? Well, in general, we can hypothesize several different fitness benefits of sociality, that is, ways that being social might improve an individual's survival and or reproduction. And we can categorize them into a bunch of different groups. We can talk about potential benefits of sociality to decreasing your risk of predation, protection from predators. We can talk about how sociality might increase your foraging success. We can talk about how it might increase your ability to find a mate, find a high quality mate, and rear offspring. And we can talk about how sociality can be sometimes expected to decrease energy use, either during locomotion or through conservation of body heat and thermal regulation. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you some examples of each of these potential benefits. And a lot of it will include some data from studies that have been done over the past few decades. And very often, the predictor variable, the x-axis variable on most of these graphs is going to be the size of the social group. Okay, so let's start with the anti-predation benefits of living in groups. Okay, so one of the most obvious ways that being in a group might protect you from predators is the dilution of risk. So the bigger the group, if a single predator comes up, if I'm in a group of 10 versus a group of 2, my odds of surviving are better in the larger group because there's just more other individuals around to dilute that risk. And so these graphs here, although they're quite small, they're all showing the same trend, and they're graphs of this phenomenon in butterflies, in ocean skaters, which is, I guess, a kind of water-striding insect, and in banded killifish, a fish that lives in shoals of various sizes. And what you're seeing is that the risk of any one individual being captured, that's what's on the y-axis, decreases the larger the group. So this seems to be a really general effect. But there's other ways that group living can increase your protection from predators as well. One way is called the many eyes effect, or through vigilance. And so these graphs are just showing the theoretical expectations. So we expect that the larger the group, the more pairs of eyes there are to potentially detect a threat, and therefore the more likely it is that you'll be protected by proxy, right? So if your neighbor notices the threat sooner than you would, that's going to help you flee in time. Okay, so here's some data from a 1970s study looking at this vigilance effect in pigeon flocks. So on the x-axis, we've got pigeon flocks that varied in size from quite small to over 50 individuals. And the researcher looked at their reaction time on the bottom there to a hawk predator, and up on top, the success rate of actual hawk attacks. So what we see is that the larger the group size, sorry, I should say the lower graph is not reaction time, it's reaction distance. So what that's telling you is how far away was the hawk when the pigeon flock reacted and fled. Okay, so it's good to react at larger distances, right? For the pigeon anyway, it helps the pigeon get away if they can react and detect the hawk at larger distances. So the larger groups, larger flocks were able to detect the predator much earlier when it was much farther away. And what you see on the top graph is that translated into a lower success of the hawk. It was not able to successfully capture prey as well in the larger groups. Okay, so beyond just vigilance, many social animals also have warning signals, communication strategies that they use to warn other individuals in the group. So they share information about a threat. So even some groups have a division of labor into specific roles where some individuals will be performing a sentinel role, like on guard, doing vigilance for the others in the group. And that role can rotate through the group. The Trafalgar effect is a word that was coined for like an escape response that spreads contagiously through a group. And so we see a lot of really neat examples of warning calls in social mammals and also social birds. These Belding's ground squirrels have specific alarm calls that they use for different types of predators. And this individual you see on the lower part of the slide is standing up tall, performing the sentinel role, ready to warn the other individuals in his social group about a threat. So another way that groups can be helpful against predators is through communal defense. So not just about detecting predators, but attacking them. And in many cases, smaller animals can overpower a much bigger one through the power of grouping. And we saw this when I showed you the peahens chasing after that coyote. Here you see a group of, I think, glaucous gulls attacking a much bigger bald eagle in Alaska. And this is some data from a study of this phenomenon from way back in the 1960s, looking at colonies of black-headed gulls. And so the researcher placed chicken eggs in the gull colonies. So the gulls don't really care too much about these chicken eggs. They're not their own eggs, but predators would love to eat those chicken eggs. And so the eggs were experimentally placed in there in different positions, either on the outside of the colony, at the border of the colony, or right inside the nesting colony of these black-headed gulls. And crows would come and try to take these eggs. And I really hate this graph. I hate these two-sided graphs. But the axis for the red data is on the left, and the axis for the blue data is on the right. And the x-axis you're seeing like a continuum of from outside the colony to inside the colony. So what you're seeing is that when the eggs were placed closer into the colony, there was a greater probability that a crow trying to get that egg would be attacked. So the more interior the eggs were placed, the more likely these gulls were going to attack that crow. And in the blue data, what you're seeing is that the more interior the eggs were placed, the less likely the crows would be successful at getting the egg. So these defenses work. Okay, and one last way that grouping can provide a predation protection mechanism is through something called the predator confusion effect. And so this is the idea that visual predators will have an increasingly difficult time fixating and capturing a specific prey individual when they're in this moving, dynamic, sometimes colorful, confusing group. And so theoretically, it's been predicted that the success rate of the predator should go down as group size goes up, and all of this like chaotic movement makes it hard to pinpoint a single prey. Now, what's been found is that this effect works best in prey groups that are phenotypically similar to each other, where all the individuals are similar. And I'm going to show you, as an aside, some data from a study of this done in fish. But first, I just want to highlight that groups are not always phenotypically homogeneous. Some social groups can be made up of multiple species. On the lower left, you see a mixed species school of fish in Indonesia. And also, a group of a single species can have phenotypic diversity. There's some species that have different phenotypic morphs, or sometimes different age individuals have different phenotypes. So snow geese are an example where the adults can have different plumage morphs, and they're all one species, but these color morphs are genetically determined. So a flock of snow geese can look heterogeneous. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so let's look at this classic study of the confusion effect in fish. So these were experiments done using a real predator, largemouth bass, and minnows as the prey. And the minnows were either their natural color or they were dyed blue to make them visually stand out. And the researchers experimentally manipulated the size of the minnow groups, these little schools that they would form in the lab. And so they had sizes ranging from 1 minnow to 4 minnows to 8 minnows, and actually 15 in this chart. And what I want you to hone in on here is that when we look at the group size of 4, the group size of 8, the group size of 15, if we go over and see in this column here, what percentage of the experimental trials ended with the bass capturing minnow or minnows. You can see it starts off the 100% with the really small groups. The predator is very successful, but it drops off rapidly. And in a group of 15 minnows, only about 1 in 10 chance of the bass only had 1 in 10 chance of capturing anything. Okay, so the confusion effect works well in these homogeneous groups, especially if you have a moderate to large group size. However, what they did next was manipulate the ratio of the odd colored individuals to the wild type color. So they had schools of 8 fish now, but they differed. They varied the proportion of individuals that were blue. And so this table of results shows that result. So focus in on the row here with 1 blue fish, and then the one down here with 7 blue fish. And what we see, if you look in the column on observed and expected attacks on the blue minnows, when there's just 1 blue minnow, 93% of the attacks were on the blue one, even though it only made up 1/8 of the school. And if you look down in the group that had 7 blue minnows, 85% of the attacks were on the blue minnows. So there's something about blue that was attractive to these predators. It was somehow easier to attract their attention. But what we see is that the heterogeneous groups also allowed the predator to be more successful overall. So not shown in the table, the groups that had these mix of phenotypes allowed the predator to restore its success rate to 80 to 90%, whereas on the previous slide, the group of 8, the predator was not very successful at all. Okay, so the confusion effect breaks down or fails when the group is phenotypically heterogeneous. And when faced with a heterogeneous group, the predator has an easier time of capturing both the common type and the odd colored type as compared to a group that would have been made up of all one type or the other. All right, so that's anti-predation benefits. What about foraging success benefits? This image shows the web of a colony made by a colony of social spiders in the tropics. So there's many examples where animals are able to collect more food by working together socially than they would be on their own. So here's some data from some classic studies of goldfish and minnows. And latency refers to how long it takes to find food. So shorter latency is better because it means you're finding the food sooner. And so in these studies, what they found was that the larger the school, the larger the group size, the faster the fish were able to discover the food in the experiment. And so this has been called, again, the many eyes effect. It's similar to the idea of having many eyes detect a predator sooner. Many eyes can also detect food resources sooner. People have also found that in many different animal species, there can be individuals within a group that will perform a producer role, doing a lot of food finding, and other individuals that might be acting as scroungers, who are kind of following the lead of the producers rather than discovering food on their own. And these roles can shift through time. Living in a group can also mean that you can capture much bigger prey than a single individual would on their own. And so this is an example of a classic study of lions showing that when females are hunting in larger group sizes, they are more successful at capturing large prey. And then on the right, we see some data from social spiders, like the example I showed a photograph a few slides earlier, showing that when they're in groups, which means that they've built a larger communal web, they're able to catch more prey per individual per hour, right? So the larger web doesn't just have, like the web that 5 spiders can produce doesn't catch 5 times the prey of one spider. It has an added benefit. It captures more than 5 times the prey that a spider on its own would be able to catch. Okay, so another way that being in a group can enhance foraging success is through problem solving. This is some data from one of the professors at U Ottawa, Julie Morin-Ferrand, who studies learning in the wild, and especially in birds. And so what she and her co-author found in these studies of great tits and blue tits, which are birds that live in Europe, is that the larger the group size, the more successful these flocks were at solving these puzzle boxes that they would set out for the birds. So the birds had to learn how to open the puzzle box to get the seeds that were locked up inside. And so the puzzle boxes were solved, were more likely to be solved by larger groups, and the birds in the larger groups got more seeds per individual. And so this kind of phenomenon probably happens in the workplace or like during group work when you're working with other students, and it's called the pool of competence hypothesis. And so the more individuals in the group, the more likely that somebody in that group might have a specific skill or previous experience that can help with a given challenge. Okay, so the third category of benefits of living in groups is benefits that have to do with mating and rearing offspring. And we'll start with a short video of sage grouse and their lek-based mating behavior.
Greater sage grouse lie low and dine on the brush for most of the year. But come spring, as many as 70 or more males meet up to perform one of the most extraordinary mating rituals in all of North America. The more experienced males grab prized spots in the middle of the group. Then, a wiggle in their walk, and a jiggle in their giblets, and it's game on. They gulp a gallon of air into pouches on their chest. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. up to 10 times a minute. Those that can't make the cut quickly get the boot. After all that, it's still up to the females to choose their man. Most will pick the same lucky guy, and we'll make it clear when they're ready. And that's it. All that work for a fleeting moment of fancy. He'll have no further contact with her or their young.
Okay. So, that's an example of a lek-based mating system like we saw with the peacocks. And that's such a mating system where the males gather into a clustered area to display and court females. It might have benefits for the females by allowing them to more effectively compare different potential mates and find the best one. So coming together for in a mating season in this kind of highly social grouped way can enhance success at finding mates. And it's not just seen in birds like these ruffs that you see on this slide or the sage grouse, but fish have systems like this as well, where there's kind of a time of year at a specific place where they'll come together, and many reproductive individuals will be available in the same place at the same time. And so as we mentioned, this might be advantageous to the females because it allows them to assess comparisons better. Also, it can result in copying where like some choosers might copy the choice of other individuals. And so this is some data from another lekking bird species, the black grouse, where the researchers observed when the females were coming to the lek and how many and who they were choosing. And then they modeled how many females would we expect to choose a given male if the females were choosing independently versus like how correlated were the females' choices in actual fact. And what they found was that the females had like kind of more similarity, more females were making the same choice in real life than you'd expect by chance if they were choosing independently. Whether copying is beneficial for females is not clear from this result, but it is quite clear that in several systems, copying does happen. Okay, so another way that living in a group can be beneficial is in rearing offspring. And so there's some systems where parents get help from other individuals in the social group. One example is the Florida scrub jay, which lives in the southern US, and young juveniles that are not yet ready to breed on their own will stay around and help the breeding adults, often their own parents, defending the territory, feeding the young, which are their young siblings, and protecting against predators. So the data that you're seeing here is from a study where helpers were removed from some of these nests. So we had experimental groups in black where the helpers were removed, and then we have these orange groups where like the birds just had the helpers that they normally would have. And what they found was that removing the helpers decreased the ability of the nest to successfully fledge offspring. So fledging is when like the young offspring survive and leave the nest. So far more fledglings were leaving the nest successfully on average with the helpers there, which makes sense. Okay, so the fourth and last category of fitness benefits of living in groups that we'll cover is energy use. And we have another short video here about why migrating geese use V formations.
Well, we're all familiar with it. As day length shortens, we look up into the sky and notice a flock of birds flying south in a V-shaped formation. It's a sure sign of fall and a wonderful spectacle of nature. But the science behind the reason why some species of birds fly in this particular orientation is actually quite fascinating as well. Studies have shown that it's all about efficiency. It's based on a principle that has also benefited military squadrons flying in similar formations, with the added advantage that all eyes are able to see forwards. It turns out that when large birds flap their wings, a circulation of air is generated. The portion that is rising is called upwash, while the portion that is sinking is called downwash. The lift provided by upwash is generated behind and to the outside of leading birds, which is a perfect place for following birds to hang out, reducing the work they have to do atop the mechanically generated cushion of air. To maximize the lift, not only do the birds get in line at a precise location, but they also flap their wings at the same time as leading birds. Should they drift into the downwash directly behind the leading bird, they flap at precisely opposite times, which is thought to reduce the effects of downwash for following birds. Since the lead bird has to do more work, leaders rotate positions to conserve energy, which distributes the workload more evenly. Now, it's not known whether the birds can simply sense these air circulations or if they may even be able to predict them, but the ability through which these birds have come to travel using such complex flight dynamics is as fascinating as it is surprising.
Okay, so if you've ever wondered why when geese are migrating and flying in these V formations, you hear them honking a lot more often than when they're flying on their own, it's probably because they have to keep in touch with each other and coordinate these formations. Okay, so there's been a lot of empirical study of the energy savings that birds get from these behaviors. Not all flocking birds will fly in V formation, but many do. And by putting biologgers on the flying birds that measure their heart rate, which is a measure of energetic expenditure, researchers have found that there's a decrease in heart rate, a decrease in energy expenditure when using the V formation compared with flying alone. Now, fish also have ways of moving in groups in ways that save energy by taking advantage of the hydrodynamics and the vortices and positioning themselves relative to each other to kind of keep energy use as low as possible. Now, I find this really interesting. Engineers studying wind power have discovered that there's ways that they can learn from what fish are doing to optimize the positioning of certain kinds of wind turbines. And there's a really interesting short article link there that you can read about that. Okay, so it's not just about locomotion. Being together in a group can be energetically beneficial in other contexts as well, like roosting or sleeping. And these graphs are really small here on the right of the slide, but the x-axis on all of those graphs is the group size. And what you're seeing is data from several different species, 6 different species of small mammals. And on the y-axis of all of these graphs is their metabolic rate. So when the mammals are sleeping and snuggling with other individuals, the metabolic rate of any one individual is able to be lower because they don't have to expend as much energy keeping themselves warm. Okay, so we've talked about the benefits of being social, but what about costs? Well, for every hypothesized benefit, we can also predict potential costs of group living. And there's a list here. It doesn't have a perfect one-to-one correspondence with the list at the beginning of this lecture, but we can predict that groups might be more conspicuous to predators, like a big group of prey is going to be like attractive to predators. We can predict that when you're in a group with other individuals, you're going to be competing more for food than you would be on your own. Also, groups can have increased risk of parasitism and disease. And in terms of your offspring and mating success, well, being in a group with other individuals, other competitors, might mean that someone might take away, compete with mating opportunities for you. Also, you might be forced to care for offspring that aren't your own through brood parasitism. And lastly, your young might be eaten by other individuals in the groups because many animals are willing to eat their own species. Okay, so a few examples from within that list. So cuckoldry just refers to when offspring are sired by another male. So we're talking about animals with mating systems where both parents care for the young. And in many birds, this is the case. So they're socially monogamous with biparental care, and we'll get into more about mating systems and parental care systems later in the course. But sometimes The young in a nest are sired by a combination of males. Sometimes they're all sired by the parental male, but sometimes some or all of the offspring are sired by some other male. And in the Montezuma or Apendula, that's a highly social bird that lives in Mexico in these dense colonies of these like beautiful pendulous nests that you see here. And so in any one nest, there can be like offspring of one male, but also of other males as well. And so what the data show on the slide down here is that the bigger the colony in a given tree, the more interference attempts that were observed, where like a male will attempt to mate or block the mating of another male, or attempt to mate with another male's social partner, or block the mating. Okay, so cannibalism and infanticide is another risk or cost of living in groups. It's especially the case in fish, where parents will lay their eggs, but these eggs will be at risk of being eaten by other individuals. And it can be in the same species or from another species. Okay, so parasitism is another really interesting one, where denser colonies just make it easier to pick up parasites. If you're living on your own, you're not so much in contact with other individuals, so you're not going to pick up parasites from them. And the data here are an example from cliff swallows, which are a bird that breeds in these really dense colonies, in these nests that they build out of like mud and saliva. And you can see pictures of the nest, of a colony of nests on the left, and then like a single nest on the right. And so they are parasitized by these swallow bugs that live on them and drink their blood, and especially parasitize the nestlings. They're quite detrimental to the nestlings. And so in the first graph on the left, what you're seeing is that the bigger the colony size, the larger the group of individuals breeding together, the greater the burden of swallow bugs per nestling. And if we look over on the far lower left of the slide, what we see is two chicks that are the same age. They're both 10 days old, but that either came from a nest that was infected or not infected with these swallow bugs. So it really is costly to have a swallow bug infestation in your nest. And so the graph on the far right shows that the more swallow bugs a nestling has, the smaller its body mass for age. So this is a cost of living in groups. Okay, so that segues nicely into the other topic I want to cover today, which is social immunity. And I want to start with a couple of video clips of social immunity in ants. So in this first clip, we're going to learn about how ants invented medicine millions of years before humans did.
The Matabele ants' strict termite diet means many of these ants' days are spent in dangerous raids on these combative insects. The termites are no pushovers, which leaves many ants wounded after each raid. Researchers recently found that injured ants are often carried back to the nest by their fellow soldiers. Now they've discovered that once back at the nest, the injured ants' wounds are treated by their nestmates, who spend time grooming the open wounds to clear debris, adding antimicrobial chemicals, and removing any pesky termites. And the treatment works. Ants treated within the first hour had a mortality rate of 10%, while ants that received no treatment had a mortality rate of 80%. Researchers found that lightly injured ants altered their behavior when near a returning column of ants. When nestmates were close, they slowed their pace dramatically, signaling that they're injured. If the ants passed them by without help, the injured ant immediately started walking faster, following them back to the nest. Ants that lost 5 or more limbs in a termite battle were rarely helped back to the nest. Normally, when an injured ant is found, it curls up into a ball to allow for easy transport back to the nest. Heavily injured ants, however, flail their remaining limbs about and spin on their backs, becoming so uncooperative that they're left behind. Moving forward, researchers hope to find out if this grooming behavior simply prevents infection after termite skirmishes, or if it could also be an effective treatment if an infectious disease attacks the colony.
All right. And so these ants are helping each other by cleaning their comrades' wounds and preventing infection. This next video gets into the mechanism of how their cleaning and allogrooming works.
That's an ant grooming its antennae. Ants need the antennae to smell food, pheromone trails, or to communicate, so it is vital for them to keep them free from any dirt. Contamination can come in different sizes and shapes, and ants have evolved special cleaning structures on their forelegs, in which they clamp the antennae and pull them through. Once the antennae are free from contaminants, ants then clean the cleaning structure itself with their mouthparts. The cleaning structure consists of 3 different zones. The bristles and the comb remove the largest particles mechanically. Smaller contaminants that make it through these first 2 filtering steps then adhere to the brush hairs. In this high magnification video, we can see that the bristles buckle while the comb stays in tight contact with the antennal surface. The combination of the different hair areas lets the cleaning structure work as a particle filter, which can clean different sized dirt particles with a single cleaning stroke. As the manufacturing process of many delicate electronic devices is highly susceptible to contamination, we hope that understanding the biomechanical principles of these cleaning structures will help us to design bio-inspired cleaning devices for cleaning on micro and nanoscale.
Okay, so they have this combination of comb and brush elements on their antenna cleaners that act like a series of filters that can clean particles and bacteria off. Okay, so shifting to our current world with the coronavirus pandemic and past pandemics that humans have experienced, it's obvious that social immunity matters. Here's an example from the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. This is a photograph of the city of Philadelphia in the United States. And the flu pandemic had just begun, and Philadelphia ignored the warnings. They held a huge parade for soldiers who were just returning from World War I that had hundreds of thousands of people crammed together. And just days later, every bed in their hospitals was filled with sick and dying patients infected by the Spanish flu. And by the time the Philadelphia government closed down the city, it was too late. But in the same year, the city of St. Louis in the United States had a very different response. Even before the first case of the Spanish flu had been reported in the city, the people in the city were on high alert, and they closed the schools and movie theaters, and public gatherings were banned. And what the data show from back then was that it made a difference. So you could see how the number of deaths per 100,000 in the population spiked at the beginning of the pandemic in Philadelphia, whereas it didn't spike in St. Louis, although it did have like a prolonged burden of death in St. Louis, whereas in Philadelphia it dropped off more quickly. So these different social responses can influence the transmission and the burden of these diseases. Okay, so social immunity. It's in humans and it's in ants and other social animals as well. So we can talk about social distancing as minimizing contact with other individuals with the goal of limiting the spread of a pathogen. But social immunity is a bigger concept that includes social distancing. And social immunity is any action of individuals in a group that protects others from infection. It was first coined in an early paper by Sylvia Kramer, who's a researcher who studies ant behavior. And eusocial species like ants have a real problem. They live at really high densities. Individuals are frequently in contact, frequently touching each other, and group members are often very close relatives, sometimes clones. So they have very high genetic similarity throughout the colony, and thus, if there's a pathogen that they're susceptible to, like if one ant is susceptible to it, it's probably the whole colony is susceptible to it. And so all of these factors together set up this scenario where it's easy for a single infection to rapidly wipe out the entire colony. So therefore, this creates pressure, selective pressure for these eusocial organisms to evolve lots of strategies for preventing infection, and hence evolve social immunity. Just as one example from bees, so bees are eusocial, and they have the ability to produce antimicrobial secretions that they use in hygiene of themselves, of each other in the colony. And in this study of several different bee species, they looked at species of bees that were solitary, that were a little bit social or semi-social, and then they looked at bee species that were eusocial or highly social. And what they found was that the antimicrobials of the social species were much, much stronger, much more effective at killing bacteria than the antimicrobials of the solitary species. So it's consistent with this hypothesis that extreme sociality should also select for really effective strategies for preventing the spread of pathogens. Okay, so a few more examples from social insects. I think these are so fascinating. Tree resin. Ants collect resin and they bring it back to the nest because resin is antibacterial and antifungal. So they bring resin back and they apply it and use it in different ways to keep dangerous fungal infections or bacterial infections from harming the colony. Honeybees do something called social fever. When a bacteria has infected the hive, the bees will coordinate and simultaneously raise their body temperature, creating like a collective fever. And this heat will kill the bacteria and help to clear the infection. Cape honeybees, a particular species, has something called social encapsulation. Probably other bees have this as well. It's just been studied in the Cape honeybees. If there's an intruding parasitic beetle, the Cape honeybees will find it and enclose it. They'll gather around it and enclose it in this propolis substance, which they make from resin, I believe. And the parasitic beetle enclosed in propolis will starve. And this is really interesting because it's analogous to the way like our internal immune cells sometimes encapsulate some invaders in our bodies. And this is a photograph of this social encapsulation response. Okay, so these strategies are really diverse. They include ways of containing or maintaining hygiene, so grooming others, which is called allogrooming, and you'll read about grooming strategies in ants when we do our readings for this week. Keeping a graveyard chamber, so often ants will remove dead individuals and keep them somewhere else, and that helps prevent pathogens that might have killed those individuals from spreading. And often there's like ants whose specific role in the colony is to remove the dead individuals. And similarly, ants will keep a waste dump that's separate from their main housing, keeping potentially dangerous bacteria and fungal growths separate from places that they need to use. And some individuals will be the garbage removers. They will also bury infectious material by covering it in soil or walling it off to contain it. And then we have behaviors that have to do with social distancing and exclusion. In honeybees, some individuals have the job of guarding the entrance to the nest. And if somebody comes back, if one of their group mates comes back infected, the guard won't let that individual enter. Ants and bees will also remove infected group mates from the nest. And it's been suggested that ants have this modular social structure where like the hive can be considered as being made up of separate modules of individuals that have, within each module, there's like different roles and jobs. So if one module, that's kind of its own social and spatial compartment of the nest, if one module gets infected, it's relatively easy to isolate it and quickly contain the infection to prevent it from spreading to the queen and the nursery, which would be deadly for the colony. Okay, so that was proposed back when Sylvia Kramer was writing about these phenomena for the first time. And then just a few years ago, these ideas about social distancing in insects were experimentally tested in a really beautiful experiment done in the lab with these black garden ants. And they were tracked in their lab colonies by these little RFID tags that can be mounted on the backs of the ants and that can allow a computational system to track every little movement and interaction, like every physical contact between two individuals. Okay, and so what they did was they took these experimental colonies and they inoculated a small number of the foragers with a fungal infection. And so what you're seeing here is graphs that represent the social network of a colony. So there's a single colony shown before the fungus was introduced and after. Okay, and so the yellow, each of the circles on this diagram represent a single ant. Okay, and so, and the lines between the circles represent the social connection between two ants. And it's based on the number of times they physically contact each other during the experiment. The yellow nodes are the foragers, and the yellow nodes that have a black circle in the middle are the foragers that got inoculated with the fungus. Okay, and the way the diagram is structured, the more frequently two individuals connect, the closer those two nodes or those two circles will be on the page, right? So, so the distance on the diagram, the physical distance represents social distance. Okay, so what did they find? Well, that the structure of the network after the fungus was introduced rapidly changed. The individuals that were infected started to remove themselves from the colony, and you can see it on the graph, right? You can see how like the infected individuals are becoming more segregated, more isolated. They're self-quarantining, and the social structure of that group changed. I think the blue one is the queen. Okay, they of course repeated this experiment over many different colonies. We're just looking at one example. And these are some data on what the individual ants were doing. The black bars are showing you the results for the infected foragers. The yellow bars are the uninfected foragers, and the green bars on the far left are the nurse ants, the ants that take care of the eggs and babies. Okay, so what we see working from the top left across, so the top left is the proportion of time spent outside the nest. So the infected individuals started spending more time outside the nest after they got infected. On the top right, the distance, the social distance of the colony became greater for the foragers that were treated, that were infected with the fungus. And then on the bottom graph, what we're seeing is how much contact they had with the brood, with the young. And what we're seeing is that the foragers spent much less time. They were less likely to, the infected individuals were less likely to contact the young after them receiving the inoculation with the pathogen. Okay, so social distancing behavior is not limited to humans. And also, they found that these changes occurred really rapidly within a day of being infected, whereas the fungus, the symptoms of the fungal infection often take a week or more to take hold. So these behavioral changes seem to be an active response by the ant, not just a side effect of the disease. Okay, so just to wrap up, what kind of traits do we expect species to have that evolve these kinds of social immunity mechanisms? So what kind of a species should evolve social immunity? Well, Sylvia Kramer has written about this, and it's thought that animals or organisms that have frequent physical contacts among group members should have a need for social immunity, but also examples where there's high genetic relatedness among the group members. And there's a couple of reasons why genetic relatedness among the group should increase or promote the evolution of social immunity. One way is that the sort of first way on the first bullet point there is that relatedness, groups with high relatedness mean that helping other individuals in the group is more beneficial through inclusive fitness. And that's a topic that we're going to cover in a couple of weeks. So don't worry about it maybe seeming mysterious now, but basically when groups are made up of close kin, it's more beneficial to help others in the group. It's more beneficial to the success of your own genes to help individuals that have similar genes to you. Also, this issue of pathogen takeover. So So when a group is very similar genetically, it's easier for a single pathogen to wipe out that group quickly. And so this is this idea that highly similar groups should have a greater need for social immunity. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. And I just want to end with a reminder that you should read these 2 articles before our synchronous meeting on Zoom on Friday, January 21. And what we'll do on Zoom is we'll put you into groups and we'll do the first homework assignment and have it done by the end of class that day. All right, see you there.